Hi everyone, and welcome to this Mental Health Academy Fireside on child ADHD and parenting. My name is Pedro Gondim. I'm Mental Health Academy CEO and your host for today. And joining us is Dr. Justin Coulson. Justin, thanks for joining us today. How are you?
Yeah, good to be with you, Pedro. Really excited for this conversation.
Likewise. And it's not the first rodeo we ride together, so it's always fun to do something with you, Justin. For those of you that have not seen Justin's many courses at MHA, credential course, and various other presentations, let me give you a brief background so you get to know your presenter a little bit more. So Dr. Justin Coulson is the co-host and parenting expert on Australia's Channel 9's Parental Guidance, the founder of happyfamilies.com.au, and one of Australia's most trusted parenting experts. His Happy Families podcast is the #1 podcast in Australia for parenting and family issues. Over the past decade, Justin has helped countless families with his 9 books on raising children, his hundreds of media appearances, including the Washington Post, the New York Times, and all of Australia's major news outlets, and 2 viral videos that have been viewed by a combined 85 million times. And I wouldn't be surprised if there's a few million more after we wrote this little bio. Finally, Justin earned his PhD in psychology. He and his wife, Kylie, have been married since the 1990s and are the parents of 6 daughters. I said 6. It's not my accent. You heard it right. Dr. Justin Coulson is also the author of Mental Health Academy's very popular 27-hour credential course titled Evidence-Based Parenting, Raising Children to Thrive. And I'm going to include links to all of this stuff on the handout that you will receive in approximately 1 hour after this presentation. If you're watching this on demand, as for the handout, we'll send you. Justin, anything else you'd like to add before we move to our housekeeping items?
No, I think that's pretty thorough. I just really work very, very hard as a researcher and as somebody who then tries to bring that research into applied context to help practitioners, to help educators, to help families, to support kids, because we know that we've got some fairly substantial challenges when it comes to kids and mental health at the moment.
Fantastic stuff, Justin. When we do, for sure, it's a good time for you to be alive. So before we get ahead of ourselves and start asking some cool questions, let me just give you a brief introduction of how this session is going to work, a couple of housekeeping items. So we've prepared an array of questions for Justin, and we'll combine these with written questions submitted by our live attendees. So if you are live with us now, you can submit a question at any time by using the Q&A function on your webinar jam window. So feel free to submit questions, comments through that. We'll try to slot them in throughout the conversation as much as possible. Second, this session is being recorded, and a link to the recording, as well as a link to a comprehensive handout, will be mailed to you approximately 1 hour after the conclusion of this presentation, live webinar, conversation, whatever you want to call it. So keep an eye on your inbox and your junk mail folders and all the folders for that email. They should be out there in about an hour after the presentation. All right, Justin, I think that's all the bureaucracy I have to go through right now, and I think we're ready to start with some questions. And the first question I'm going to ask you is just a little bit more of a background. So tell us a bit more about your professional background and why you decided to become a parenting educator.
Okay, so I'll try to do this really briefly because I really want to get to the content as quickly as we can. In short, I did very, very badly in high school, had no interest in school, wanted to be a radio announcer, ended up getting a job in radio and then followed that career to its zenith. I completed my radio career in my late 20s at one of Australia's biggest radio stations at the time. It was called Brisbane's B105. As a young dad with a couple of kids, what I was discovering is that while I was very effective in my professional life, personally, I had no idea what I was doing. I was failing as a father. I was a pretty ordinary husband. I was kind of selfish and, well, I don't know if I just expected everyone to do as they were supposed to do, and that included my 3-year-old, and it wasn't working. After a particularly bad incident where, I mean, it had been escalating for a while, but I had this particularly bad incident where I really lost it with my 3-year-old and did all the things you're not supposed to do. I recognized that I needed help because I was never going to go and get therapy. I was not that kind of guy. I was too tough and too manly for that kind of thing. I decided instead to go back to school and study psychology. I figured instead of seeing a therapist, I'll become one. So I did a psychology degree, and then did a PhD. So 8.5 years of full-time study, working 3 part-time jobs while raising a family. My wife and I went from having the 2 kids to 3 to 4 to 5. I became a university lecturer, worked in the Illawarra Institute for Mental Health and also the School of Psychology at the University of Wollongong. Lectured for 2 to 3 years at the university, everything from first year through to master's students. Mainly focused on the psychology of well-being, positive psychology, but I also dabbled a little bit in some psychopathology and also in recovery services, and eventually left the academic context and started writing books and giving talks. Had our 6th daughter a short time later. So for the last 15 years or thereabouts, I've been essentially a lapsed academic, a professional speaker, an author, a TV presenter, a podcaster. We have the #1 podcast in Australia for parenting and family stuff. In fact, if you want to check it out, I'm very excited about it. Today, we dropped our 1000th episode of the podcast, and the team put together something really nice that was a bit of a surprise for me. I didn't know it was coming, and it was just beautiful. So that's kind of the short version of how I got to be here. I've been writing and speaking and presenting and thinking very, very deeply about how we can support parents. I mean, I'm interested in children and child development significantly, but my main emphasis, my main push is how do we help parents? And Pedro, I want to say this up front at the very beginning. I know that there are going to be a lot of people who are listening to this right now who do a lot of work with children. I don't have a problem with that. In fact, sometimes that's absolutely necessary. But I'm pretty satisfied from a careful review of what research indicates that if we're going to help children, the best thing we can do is work with their parents. The reason for that is if you're working with a kid, I don't know, like 11 o'clock on Monday morning, and they're dealing with an anxiety issue, or they're dealing with an emotion regulation challenge, or whatever it might be, at 3 o'clock that afternoon, when one of their siblings does something that is frustrating or upsetting, or when they're encountering a situation that's challenging, that 10-year-old kid is not going to go, oh, this morning I remember learning that thing in the psychology office or in the counselor's clinic. They're not going to go, let me extract that and try and practice it. They just don't. They don't have the skills. They don't have the cognitive capacity to do that well. But when we train parents, when we help parents with skills, the parents can be there as a consistent guide and as a gentle reminder for the kids, and they can support them through their challenging moments. So I'm a really big advocate for people who are working with parents, helping them to upskill the parents. To me, that's where we really move the needle and we support the kids the best. That was the short version. Gee, I'm glad I didn't give you the long one.
Fantastic. No, that was great. And I like also the introduction about upskilling parents. That's really important. And sometimes, that's how you resolve the problem, not by tackling the problem directly, but like figuring out what's happening around it. And things happen more naturally that way. All right, Justin. So jumping into the less personal questions, there's been a lot of talk and media coverage about ADHD and children recently. How pervasive is ADHD and how is it impacting children and families?
Okay, let's talk about the incidence and prevalence of ADHD. The short answer is we don't really know. And the reason that I say that is because both within Australia and across the world, we have so many different ways of assessing it. There's some really thorough assessment that goes on, and there's also some really slap happy, throw it together kind of assessment that happens. In fact, there was a report published just yesterday in Brisbane, Australia, that indicated that teachers are now diagnosing ADHD. Now, I didn't get time before we have had this conversation to look carefully at what's going on here, but essentially what the suggestion was in this report, from what I could make out, is that around about 25% of students in Queensland public schools now have an ADHD diagnosis, or teachers are saying that they've got ADHD and then sending them off to counsellors and therapists to get formal assessments, some of which are continued right through and others which are not. So we've got data purportedly indicating that 25% of public school students in Queensland have ADHD. In some parts of the United States, I've seen data indicating that. A similar number at 25 to 27%. But you look at somewhere like Finland, and the numbers vary between about 1% and 3%. So globally, we've got this huge discrepancy around ADHD diagnosis. It also depends on whether you're looking at clinical samples or population samples, how we're getting what age the students are, whether we're looking at boys or girls. So there's a lot of variation when we try to understand exactly how much this is happening. Here's what we do know. And I'm going to say some provocative things that are going to be a little bit hard to hear, but this is what we know. I'm focused on facts, not ideology. Facts, we know that boys are diagnosed with ADHD significantly more than girls. I should also highlight, we're talking about both the hyperactive impulsive ADHD as well as inattentive ADHD, as well as a combined type. There is a fourth unspecified type as well, but we don't really hear very much about that. Girls do tend to show up with more inattentive diagnoses, but overall boys just absolutely, it's the number one most diagnosed psychological, neurological, or emotional, most people agree that it's a neurological disorder. However, there is still some questions being asked about that. So I'm going to speak about it as a neurological disorder, but some people are still saying that it is an emotional or a psychological or even a social disorder. Some people still argue that it's an environmental disorder. And it could be that it might be a bit from column A, B, C, and D. Who knows? The science is far from settled, even though ideology demands that we call it a neurological disorder. Just wanted to highlight that. So we know that boys, far more than girls, are diagnosed. But here's the other thing that we know. It seems that there's a maturity element to this as well. That is, there may be something developmental. And the reason that I say that is we know that if you're in the bottom quintile, of your cohort from an age and development perspective, you're significantly more likely to be diagnosed than if you're in the top quintile. That is, ADHD sometimes shows up not because of potentially neurology, but perhaps instead because of maturity and development. We also know that kids that come from poorer households, socioeconomic status is a predictor of whether a kid is going to have an ADHD diagnosis or not. We also know that kids that are raised in homes where there is a single parent, and we also, just on that, only 4% of homes where single parents are leading the home are dads, so it's mainly single mums. Single parenting, low socioeconomic status, these seem to be predictors of ADHD and being young for your cohort. So not politically correct, not ideologically nice to hear, but overwhelmingly the data seem to point in that direction. And then we've just got the fact that...
Just a quick comment on that note, because I've got a question here that I think it's slotting well with that comment.
Yeah.
You're mentioning about predictors such as coming from a poor socioeconomic status. There was a question here from Robina asking whether ADHD is hereditary or if it's a result of trauma, or if trauma is a result of difficult ADHD. So it kind of hooks up well with the thing about coming from a socially poorer kind of circumstance. Do you know much about that?
Okay, so let's just talk about trauma for a sec. My view on trauma is a little bit... trauma has started to be talked about in new ways in the last, I'm going to say, decade, ways that it hadn't previously been talked about. And trauma is having a real moment, I guess. We're talking about trauma more than ever. I was having a conversation with, I'm going to name drop here. This is my weak flex for the conversation, so forgive me. Some people might be familiar with Dr. Lisa D'Amour. She's a very, very highly esteemed parenting expert in the United States. And we were talking about trauma, and I put something to her. I just said, my sense is that trauma is fundamentally a result of maladaptive processing. And if we can help people to process the challenging events that they experience in their lives, then they will not experience ongoing trauma. That is, it may have been a traumatic event, but because of adaptive processing, because of healthy ways of working through it, they no longer experience trauma in relation to that event. You and I can experience the same event completely differently based on how well we process it. And she said a couple of wise things around that, and essentially said, yeah, that's what it is. If we can help people to process traumatic events, then they don't experience ongoing trauma. Therefore, the event ceases to be traumatic except for the moment that it happened. It doesn't have any lasting impact. This is fundamentally at odds with people like Gabor Mate and Bessel van der Kolk, body keeps the score sort of stuff, who have created a trauma industry with a very limited evidence base. So I just wanted to indicate this question of trauma and highlight it in the framework that I'm going to describe it, and that is maladaptive processing. If we bring that back to ADHD, therefore, is ADHD a result of trauma? Well, if somebody is not processing well, now they're going to have problems with regulation. There's going to be self-management challenges. Their cognitions may be a little bit hazy, fuzzy, haphazard, and ongoingly, they're going to have difficulties with behavior and emotional regulation. They may be impulsive. They may be struggling. But I would generally say that that is not going to be ADHD. I think that's going to be misdiagnosed trauma. I think ADHD is a completely different thing. ADHD is fundamentally an inhibition and regulation challenge. Now, that may result from trauma, but I wouldn't say that it's ADHD. I'd say it's a regulation challenge resulting from trauma. If we can get the trauma satisfied and processed well, then the regulation problems should disappear, which means that we don't have an ADHD problem anymore because it wasn't ADHD in the first place. I don't know if that's a helpful response, but that's the way that I would tend to frame that kind of a conversation.
That's helpful. Thanks, Justin. What are some of the common misconceptions about ADHD that mental health professionals should be aware of? And how can these misconceptions impact the effectiveness of treatment?
Yeah, so common misconceptions around ADHD, most of us would be familiar with them anyway because we hear them from grandmas and aunties and uncles and hardcore dads who are saying they've just got to get it together. And the misconception is basically that the child doesn't have anything wrong with them. They're just a bratty child, or they've got an attitude adjustment, or they're not motivated. So there's a question of motivation and ability with ADHD that we need to really consider. Is my child lacking motivation, or does my child lack the ability? And I love Ross Greene's phrase. For those who are not familiar with Ross Greene, he's a Harvard-trained psychologist who's put together something called, CPS, Collaborative and Proactive Solutions. It's quite a complicated model. Our model has a lot in my model has a lot in common with his. I just think mine's simpler. It's more parsimonious. It's easy to use, but I love his work. And Ross Greene says kids do well if they can. Kids do well if they can. And so he's arguing that kids are motivated and it's an ability issue. And I think that that's a really great reminder for those parents who have this misconception that they just need to, their kids need to be more motivated, because it's not a motivation issue, it's an ability issue. Outside of that, there are a lot of misconceptions that ADHD is not a thing, that it doesn't exist. I think we have enough evidence now that ADHD really is a thing, and it always has been. We just didn't recognize it. That's a really big misconception that is quite damaging. But another misconception that I want to highlight just briefly is that we need to label every ADHD child with ADHD and help them to understand what that diagnosis means. My youngest child, and just to highlight, we don't have any socioeconomic issues in my family. We have sufficient for our needs. We're not wealthy by any stretch, but we're doing okay. We've got two parents together. My daughter was one of the oldest in her cohort, and yet she scores off the charts on ADHD, and she's pretty oppositional as well. We've got the quinella, the double. We've got the double, whatever it is, and she's hardcore. I've raised 5 other daughters, and this one is nothing at all like her. ADHD is a thing. I've got firsthand experience with it. I've watched it happen, and fundamentally, it just comes down to this regulation and inhibition challenge. I mean, we could talk about misconceptions all day, but for me, they're the main ones.
Thank you very much, Justin. One of the hot topics in this area is the discussion around embracing and affirming neurodiversity, versus creating a treatment approach when looking at ADHD. I see both as being relevant and complementary. How would you approach this topic?
Yeah, I'd agree. By making a child feel like they have a deficit, my favorite framework, the one that has more evidence behind it than anything else on the planet in psychological terms, is a theory that I hope most people are familiar with, but unfortunately too many still aren't, and it's called self-determination theory. I'm going to drop another quick name and give another mild flex. The lead researcher who is responsible for self-determination theory is a guy called Professor Richard Ryan. He and his colleague Ed Deasy developed self-determination theory in the 1970s. And over the years, I've become really good friends with Rich. I had dinner with him in Sydney just last week. My wife and I went out with his wife and we talked all about this particular topic. I let him know that I was going to be having this conversation and asked what I needed to talk about. Self-determination theory argues that you and I and the children with whom we work all have three basic psychological needs. As humans, it's common to humanity. We need these three things to flourish. Now, to be clear, there may be more than just these three basic psychological needs, but the evidence absolutely unquestionably supports these three categorically. A stronger evidence base, like I said, than any other psychological theory in the world. And the theory says basic psychological need number one is relatedness. Now, I want to step back a little bit, actually. I'm going to come back to these three basic psychological needs in just a sec. But I think with this particular audience, I normally wouldn't do this for a typical audience, but for this audience, I think this is relevant. When we look at parenting styles argue, if you look at Diana Borman's research and Maccabee and Martin and all of the people who have had their fingers in the parenting style literature since the 1960s, when Borman lifted her ideas from a guy called Earl Schaefer, who developed a three-way model in the 1950s. She said that three things matter, building on his work. Number one, we need to have responsiveness in parenting. Number two, we need to have demandingness in parenting. And number three, we need to have autonomy support in parenting. Responsiveness means warmth and nurture. It means when your child needs you, you turn to them and you respond to them. Demandingness means you have limits and boundaries. Autonomy support, well, that was a little bit fuzzy and they weren't quite sure what to do about it. But basically, it was this idea that, well, children should have some say sometimes in some things. But it was the 1950s, 1960s. That wasn't particularly popular. And when Borman started to put this into a model, I don't know if you've ever tried to put three dimensions into a model. It's really complex. And so what she did was she talked about autonomy support, but she took the other two, responsiveness and demandingness, and she made a little 2x2 table, because everybody in psychology loves a 2x2 table. And she said, if you can be high or low on either of these. If you're low on both, you're a neglectful parent. Neglectful parenting leads to fairly poor outcomes for children. If you're high on responsiveness but low on demandingness, you're what's called a permissive parent. But here's where it gets curious. Over the years, people added additional words into that quadrant. They said, in addition to being a permissive parent, you're a laissez-faire parent, and you might also be an indulgent parent. Now, indulgence and permissiveness are very different things. Being laissez-faire is fundamentally different to that, but they all got lumped into the one. Borman's initial conceptualization and the best science still points to permissiveness. And the outcomes for for kids from permissive homes aren't actually that bad. They don't like authority. They don't like being told what to do, but there's that responsiveness, that warmth, that nurture that seems to support them in fundamentally developmentally healthy ways. Then if we go up to high demand but low responsiveness, these are the authoritarian families, my way or the highway. This is actually more damaging than permissiveness, because kids feel like they can't measure up, they can't be good enough. And then we have the authoritative parent. This has been seen as the gold standard of parenting since the 1960s. This is the parent who is really beautiful with responsiveness and really great with demandingness. Rich Ryan and Ed Deasy have developed a model that calls into question the fundamentals of Borman's parenting styles. So instead of speaking about responsiveness, they talk about relatedness. And I think this is really important, because responsiveness versus relatedness, the idea of responsiveness is I'm the unilateral arbiter of everything that happens in this home, and I will choose whether I will or won't respond to you. In other words, all power is vested in the parent, and the parent determines, do I or don't I respond? Whereas relatedness, well, that's about connection and belonging and mattering. The second basic psychological need is called competence. Now, competence, again, is fundamentally different to demandingness. Demandingness is, I expect that you will live up to this expectation. Here are the limits, here are the boundaries. Now, careful parents will have demands that are developmentally appropriate. Nevertheless, demandingness is still centering all power in the parent, whereas competence is built on structure, frameworks, systems, scaffolding. If I want my child to be competent and have that basic psychological need supported, what I do is I say to my child, I want mornings to go well, and we need to develop a framework for mornings so that we can feel good about mornings. Quick pro tip: if you're working with families who are chaotic in the mornings, maybe part of their structure, so that they can be competent in the mornings rather than chaotic, maybe part of their structure might be that they remember that the morning begins the night before, and that they set up a structure in the evening so that the kiddo is running around and getting their school uniform or their school belongings or their lunchbox or their shoes or their sports gear or their library book. They get that ready the night before so that in the mornings, they don't have the same pressure. Just as a quick aside. The third basic psychological need that DC and Ryan developed in self-determination theory, wait for it, autonomy support. That thing that got forgotten in Borman's model. The thing that only people who have delved deeply into parenting research know exists, autonomy support. So back to your question, Pedro, when we're dealing with ADHD, I think it's useful to look at basic psychological needs. If I've got a child who has regulation and inhibition challenges, my suggestion would be that coming down hard on that kid is going to make them feel completely incompetent, so it crushes competence needs. It's going to rupture the relationship because we've just chastised them. And ultimately, we're going to step into control mode, which means that they're going to want to rebel and push back. Fundamentally, what I think we need to be doing is helping kids with ADHD feel competent. Helping them feel competent means developing structures that work for them. And the best way to do that is to bring their voice in. We sit down and we say, we seem to be really struggling with mornings. Or every time I ask you to get off the screen, we have a really big problem. Or whenever you go to school and this thing happens, there's a blow up and I get a telephone call from the school. So we're highlighting, we've got a problem. The child knows it. And then we get to explore, why do you reckon that's happening? And perhaps we say to them, it could be your ADHD. But mostly what's going on here is you're struggling to regulate. The accelerator gets pushed down on your emotional brain. The limbic system fires up. The amygdala goes into red alert. And everything. Kids don't know how to apply the brakes in those situations. They just don't know how to slow this thing down. And so then we get to say to them, so we've clearly got a problem here. How do you think we can solve it? What can we do structurally? What frameworks can we put in place so that you can get a handle on this, so that we can build your competence? To me, that kind of a model, I call it the 3 E's of effective discipline: explore, explain, and empower. That kind of a model is going to help a child to have a voice, feel like they've got answers, so they're competent, and support relationships. That's where I'd be pushing, Pedro, in response to your question. I've kind of taken your question and reshaped it and molded it and come out the other end somewhere else, but I hope that that's useful. Do you want to say the question again to make sure that I got the question responded to?
No, it was about the main misconceptions. Oh, sorry, no, actually, there was the question about embracing and affirming neurodiversity versus the treatment approach. Yeah. Right.
So what we're doing here with this, as you said, it's a bit of column A and a bit of column B. We're trying to do both here by working through a process that satisfies and supports basic psychological needs. Our treatment process is affirming of the neurodiversity. I think that it's unfair? No. My sense is it's not appropriate for us to affirm something that is maladaptive. Okay, so ADHD, to get a diagnosis, a person has to be experiencing these inhibitory and regulatory challenges in a way that disturbs function, in a way that is maladaptive. I don't believe that we want to be supporting and celebrating maladaptive behaviors, maladaptive responses to challenging situations. So I've got a challenge here with a neuroaffirmative model when the neuro challenges lead to dysfunction. I'm absolutely about celebrating diversity and affirming the strengths that come from a mind that can go a million different ways and can sometimes be dysfunctional. I have informally, I've gone through, I've got a PhD in psychology. I feel safe. I'm on safe ground saying what I'm about to say. I've gone through the criteria for an adult diagnosis of ADHD. I tick the boxes really, really well. However, I don't claim that I'm an ADHD adult. Why? Because it's not maladaptive. It's not dysfunctional. I've figured out how to structure my life in a way that the strengths that come from having a brain that does this stuff my world fits around that really, really well. I've created a world where it's not maladaptive and it's not dysfunctional. So therefore, neuroaffirmation, 100%, yeah. But if you've got a child who is in a system or a structure that is just not working, then if we want to be affirmative, we need to work out what we can do to change the system and the structure. I hope that makes sense. I know that it's one of those areas where
absolute sense. Yeah.
Yeah. Some people get very, very defensive about this and say, we have to be affirmative. We have to be affirmative. We have to be affirmative. I don't see any value in being affirmative when it's fundamentally destructive. And it's not that the behavior is destructive. It's that in the context of the school or in the parenting situation or in the relationship here or there, that this is not working for the child there. So is there a problem with ADHD? No, but in the context, yes. And so we've either got to we've got to change the context fundamentally, or we've got to give the child, well, both. We've got to give the child the skills to adapt to the context, because the reality is not all contexts are going to, you can't always shape your world to make the ADHD fit.
Yeah, I guess to summarize very, very briefly, like you can still be affirmative without just completely throwing out the diagnostic criteria and the impact that diagnosis has.
Thank you.
Which is where the conversation gets lost sometimes, which is, every conversation these days seems to be very much on the one end of the spectrum or another, unfortunately. And this is probably just another side effect of it. It's just another conversation that people tend to take extremes instead of integrating both sides.
Great. And I don't think that it's healthy to be at either end. I think the polarizing approach, it doesn't support the kids. It's just not helpful.
Just hooking on to the talk about diagnosis, there's a question from Sarah. Can you speak to the challenges with diagnosis with high-functioning girls who exhibit ADHD symptoms?
So diagnosis is not something that I do professionally. This is a bit of a tricky one for me to answer and give a level of detail outside of saying I've spoken to many diagnosticians who highlight that this is really tricky. It's a really big challenge. The kids know how to mask, or they figure out how to regulate in that context, and then they go home and fall apart. And so they have the emotional outburst, and the child says, "Oh my goodness, this is killing me." And the teacher says, no, they're absolutely fine. Or it can sometimes be misdiagnosed as anxiety, or sometimes this anxiety, like maybe it's a dual diagnosis. All I can really say to this one, Sarah, because I don't do diagnosis, that's not what I'm qualified to do, is that I understand that it is really, really challenging and it requires considerable care. If we go back to the question previous, this is why school teachers should not be involved in diagnostic process other than to give a report on what's happening with the student in the classroom. That's it. We shouldn't be asking a school teacher to be a therapist or to be a diagnostician. We shouldn't be asking a school teacher whether a child has ADHD. The teacher doesn't know. They're not qualified to know. They don't do that.
Thanks, Justin. I think that question stretches to older adult women as well. It's been historically, that's been a tendency of ADHD to be associated with boys, and there's a lot of women that have been missed on those diagnostics when they were kids, and they kind of grew up that way. I think there's been a few papers published. I'm just looking for one here that's a systematic review. I'm going to drop it on the chat, and it's going to be on the session notes as well.
While you're looking for that, yep. I had two women came up to me after I presented on ADHD at a seminar in Victoria a little while ago, and they just said, we only found out in the last 6 months that we both got ADHD, and everything makes sense. The whole world now makes sense. Like, they were so elated that they received that diagnosis, and their whole life suddenly, boom, 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 everything fell into place. So like, oh, that explains it. So hearing you say that, again, as an extension of Sarah's question, just highlights the challenge and the relief that can come, especially for an adult who realizes that. Totally.
Yeah. All right. So the next question is from Daniela, and she's asking about the relationship between nutrition and ADHD, the brain-gut axis. Do you know much about the research around that?
Okay. So I haven't done a lot of research in this area, but I have done a little bit, and I think that it's really compelling and it's really provocative, and people don't like it. I mean, even in academia, it's one of those things that causes a lot of arguments. So there are some people who come down firmly on the side of diet has nothing to do with ADHD, and there are some people who come down firmly on the side that diet does have something to do with ADHD. the most recent research report, I don't have it to hand. I read it about 3 or 4 months ago. It was such a great article. It was a synthesis and review, and it made the claim strongly and convincingly that diets high in processed food, that diets high in sugar, that diets that move away from what is healthy seem to be associated with ADHD. Now, I want to be really clear. This is an association. It's not causal. It might be that parents of ADHD children are just so tired of having fights about what the kids eat that they just give them whatever they want. It could be that ADHD kids are just eating lots of sugar because parents are exhausted. That's not the claim that these authors made, and I tend to agree with them. It seems that our junk food diets have an impact on the way that our gut health works, on the way that our brain works, on the way that our body works, and specifically on regulatory capacity inhibition. So that's all I've got. Like I said, not an area of my expertise, but when I've been watching this debate from afar and dipping in and dipping out, I think that the argument that diet does have an impact is compelling. Do I think that it's the central issue? No, but I think that it's a compelling argument.
Thank you, Justin. In your experience, what are the most effective non-pharmacological interventions for managing ADHD symptoms in children, and how can clinicians integrate these into their practice?
I love this question. Number one, physical activity, especially outside. Nature is fuel for the soul. It's not just the movement, it's the being outside of the four walls and the ceiling. It's just so valuable. I could talk about it for ages, but I'm going to move on to number two. But let me restate. Number one, nature and exercise. Number two, connected relationships, especially within the family. That is, children feeling seen and heard and valued. That doesn't mean that they have total freedom, it doesn't mean that they have complete independence. In fact, they have really clear structures. Parents do a great job of making sure that systems and frameworks and limits and boundaries exist. Usually they develop them with the child, but every now and again, the parent has to be the prefrontal cortex of the family and just say, look, I'm the parent. This is how it has to be because you're too young to understand. You can't see around corners and see through the shadows like I can. But fundamentally, physical activity and great relationships would be my first two. The third thing, unpopular for me to say, but absolutely necessary, reducing screens. Reducing screens is just an almost impossible thing to demand of parents who are already struggling, already time poor, already feeling the pressure, and who just want a break, but reducing screens. Basically, the more the parents can get outside with their kids and ride bikes or kick balls or throw frisbees or swim in the water or fly kites or build forts or cubby houses, or the more that parents can do that stuff, and as the kids get older, encourage the kids to do that with their friends, the less likely it is that those ADHD symptoms are going to destroy their lives. Getting them involved in organized sport as they get older, I would argue against organized sport under the age of 9 or 10. Kids are so concrete in their thinking. And please remember, with ADHD kids, especially boys, the need for competence is so strong between the ages of, I'm going to say between like 7 and 11. There's something going on in that age bracket where kids feel like they have got to be competent. And when they can't get everything right, they say, I'm taking my bat and ball, I'm going home. It's a dummy spit. Toys are out of the cot. I don't like this. It's so important for them to feel competent and to do well. And their identity is tied up with whether they can be a winner or a loser. My strong encouragement, therefore, is that organized sport, don't get the kids into it until they're at least 10, 11, maybe even 12, because that's when they start to understand that their identity is not tied up in winning and losing, and they understand how competition works. Having them play games at home is a great precursor to that. You know what it's like when you're playing checkers or chess with an 8-year-old and they lose and they start bawling their eyes out, and like they've got to learn how this stuff, they've got to develop the competence, but they've also got to learn that losing is just part of life. They've got to learn to lose well, and that's when they're ready for competition. So all of that to say, we want them to be physically active, in relationship, off screens, getting enough sleep, and eating well. To me, they're the central non-pharmacological approaches to dealing with ADHD, creating a neat, supportive environment when there are challenges that arise, having healthy relationships where we sit down and explore what's going on, explain what our expectations are, and then empower them to come up with solutions that work for everybody. I kind of sound like I'm a one-trick pony when I say that, but the research points so strongly in that direction. There's a brilliant paper. Oh, gosh. I wonder where I've got it. I know that I've got it here. Give me one sec. I'm going to see if I can find at least the title for you. Oh, gee. Wouldn't you know it? On the spot, and I can't find it. There is a brilliant ADHD paper that's been written. I can't even remember the author's name now. She's from, I think, is there a university in Huddersfield? Does that sound right? Pedro, I'll find the paper and I'll send it through to you, and you can share it in everybody's show notes. It's such a great paper.
Diagnosing attention deficit a disorder. Would that be the paper?
I can't remember. What's the name of the author?
Multiple authors. Using artificial intelligence, clinical study in the UK. That's from the University of Huddersfield. Would that qualify? It's got Chen, Takmadzidis, Batsakis, Adamu, Papadakis. Looks like a lot of Greeks involved in this study.
It's not the one, but I will find it and I will send it through. Because
I'll drop this one in the chat notes anyway, because it might be an interesting one.
Okay. I think I found it. It's by Rebecca Champ. That's right, Rebecca Champ. It's called, this is in Psychological Review in December 2022. It's called Seeking Connection, Autonomy, and Emotional Feedback, a self-determination theory of self-regulation in attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. I will also share that in the chat right now. This paper, I think, is life-changing when it comes to the work that we do with ADHD kids and really getting an understanding of the basic psychological needs that kids have. It's so much more advanced than anything else that I've read. And it's just sort of at the beginning, but my goodness, it's good stuff. So have a look at that, see how you go. Oh, I've lost you, Pedro. I can't hear you.
Yeah, it helps if I unmute myself.
Gotcha.
Are there any other specific interventions or techniques or communication tips that you would provide to parents to help their children manage ADHD?
I think that really the only other place that I would focus is not on the children. I would focus on the parents. And the things that I'd be focusing on with parents are parents' own emotional self-awareness, parents' self-regulation strategies, and parents' empathy, helping them to work on perspective and seeing the world through their children's eyes. Often when you're dealing with ADHD kids, you're dealing with a range of other challenges as well. And whether it's comorbidities or whether it's just the stress of family life, and helping parents to step into healthy self-regulation and adaptation patterns themselves is going to be central. The other thing to highlight is that ADHD seems to have a fairly strong hereditary component, which would suggest that by helping parents with these things, we're probably going to help them with maybe undiagnosed ADHD in themselves. We're going to help them to navigate and manage some of the challenges that they're experiencing. Quite often we see parents of ADHD kids struggle with their own, with modeling the very behavior that they want to see in their children. Their child is uninhibited, the child is lashing out, the child's struggling with regulation. And what does the parent do? Well, emotions are contagious. So the child goes to here and the parent goes to here emotionally as well, or even higher, to try and tamp this down. And so from my perspective, the more we can help parents to be calm, regulated, engaged, the better they'll be. There's a mnemonic that I share with parents in almost every presentation that I deliver. And it is that high emotions equals low intelligence. This matters so much because if emotions are contagious and if I catch my kids crazy or cranky or chaos, then I'm not going to be able to. I mean, you've probably noticed this. The more emotional you are, the more stupid you are, right? Like, I know that's a rude thing to say, but it's kind of true. You get really emotional and then you start acting in ways that are not rational and not sensible. Somebody cuts you off on the road and you get emotional about it. And suddenly you're yelling abuse at this person from within your car. They can't hear you, but you're behaving in a way that you would never normally rationally behave because you got emotional. Our children often do this to us. The children of the clients that you're working with, they will often do that to their parents. And if the parents do have anxiety or ADHD or any other undiagnosed challenge, or maybe they're just stressed, or maybe they're doing it on their own and they're feeling overwhelmed, helping them with those things, to me, that's going to be the key. That's really the key. So that's where I'll leave the answer to that question. I think that's the most important thing I can say.
Thank you, Justin. With regards to communications and potentially the labeling of a child having an ADHD, do you have any recommendations on how parents should talk about it? One of the concerns that Barbara raised here is that, if a child is told they have ADHD, they might alienate them, or it might also transfer responsibility away from parents. Maybe there are things that they're doing that it's contributing to the problem by saying that the child is the problem because they have the ADHD. So do you have any tips or any experience around the area, any stories that you've heard that might be helpful?
Okay. I'm so torn on this topic. I really struggle with the correct answer for this topic, and I'm living it with my own daughter. So maybe I'll pull back the curtain and tell you what I'm doing, and then I'll tell you what I tell everybody, because they're not consistent. My daughter doesn't know that she has ADHD. We haven't told her that. She struggles so much with schooling that we are now homeschooling our 10-year-old because it just doesn't work. She can't handle the school environment. She gets in so much trouble from the teachers that it's insane. And part of it is because as an ADHD child, she gets bored. She becomes, she's combined type. She gets really, really bored. She becomes completely inattentive. She is impulsive. She talks when she shouldn't. She acts in ways like she's impulsive. But also, as we all know with ADHD kids, once they latch on to something, they get into hyper-focus mode, and then you can't break them out of it. And so Emily will do all of this stuff that annoys the teacher, but then she'll finally latch onto this thing and she'll be in. And then the teacher 5 minutes later will say, all right, it's time to shift to this new task. And Emily will say, no, I'm in, I'm doing this thing. And school has just been horrendous for her. Now, we hope that when she's ready for high school, that her maturity and her regulatory capacity and her capacity to inhibit will have improved to the point where we can send her back to school. We don't want to homeschool her. Homeschooling sucks. It's the worst. And because we've lost our lives, my wife particularly, I mean, I'm still living my life, but my wife, oh my goodness, the sacrifice on her part is phenomenal. We don't want to homeschool, but school just was not working and she couldn't get the support she needed at school. Not every family is in that position where they can do that, or if they do, it comes at a tremendous sacrifice and increases their stress, and we're experiencing that. So we haven't told her that she has ADHD. Why? I guess for all the talk about neuroaffirmation before, because this is so maladaptive, we don't want to encourage it, number one. Number two, we don't want her to live into a label and have an excuse. As she gets older, we probably will tell her, but we'll tell her in a way that it's contextualized and it helps her to make sense of things. At this point, because we're adapting the environment, this is working for us. Now, what do I tell other parents? I tell other parents that they want to tread really carefully, and that if they're going to give their child this label, that the label should never be used as an excuse or as a cop-out or as a reason why. And we should never start to defend the label. There are some people who use a label to defend all of their subsequent actions. I'm speaking specifically about school refusal. There are some people who join groups and say, well, my child has this thing called school can't. And because my child has school can't, they can't go to school. And if somebody comes to them with a solution, they say, oh, no, that won't work because my child has school can't. And so defending the label then becomes, school refusal, school can't, emotion-based school avoidance, what it's called. It's not a diagnosis, right? We don't have good research on this at all. Anyway, I digress. So I'm really hesitant around labels, especially for younger kids. As they get older, I think it's appropriate to tell them, long way to say the short version, which is, it's up to you, but I don't think that telling kids is helpful when they're young.
Thanks, Justin. That is a tricky one.
It is a tricky one.
What are your thoughts on the use of technology such as apps and wearable devices in supporting children with ADHD, and how can it be incorporated into treatment plans for clinicians?
My thoughts are that I'm open to it, but I want to see the evidence. So far, I haven't seen anything that, and I haven't seen everything. So there may be things that are out there that are brilliant that I'm just not aware of. I'm yet to see anything that is ultimately supportive. Everything that I've seen seems to gamify emotion regulation and has this extrinsic focus. And what I'm more interested in is helping parents take the slow approach and develop the inhibition and regulation over time through careful competence building and structure provision, and through relationships and connection, and through autonomy support, where parents are gently being that wise guide when children want to do crazy things. If there is an app that's out there that is useful, then I'm all for it. I just haven't seen great quality apps that don't turn it into a screen addiction and a gamified version of, like a really shallow, hollow version of what we're trying to achieve. I just haven't seen it there. If it exists, I want to know about it, and I want to see the evidence.
Thanks, Justin. Can you discuss the importance of collaboration between mental health professionals, educators, healthcare providers in addressing children with ADHD? Any examples or effective communication tools or skills that you can recommend?
Generally, I would say, and I'm not speaking about people who are on this call, I clearly don't know people's individual circumstances, but generally I would say that we do this really, really poorly, with some wonderful exceptions. Every now and again, so much of my work is professional speaking, and I'll be in, about 60% of my work is in schools. So I'll go to a school, I'll give a talk, I'll speak with the wellbeing leader or the head of students or the school principal or whatever. And in many schools, I see this beautiful, beautiful synergy where parents are having clear conversations with the head of wellbeing and with the school counselor, or the psychologist is integrating with the key people at school, and they're aware of the student, they're aware of the needs, and they're able to make provision to accommodate and also push. See, if we make too many accommodations, kids get too comfy and they start to live into the label. But if we can make the accommodations with the expectation that we're going to do like this week, but next week we're going to try and go here, and we're going to continue to push, or next month or next year, we're going to continue to push in the direction of progress and help you to adapt. I see that happening. And when we get the OT, or we get the psych, or we get the school counselor, or we get the teacher or the head of whatever and the parent all communicating together, oh my goodness, it's so profoundly powerful. The drawbacks here, the challenges are the time, the resource around time. It's so hard to get all those people communicating well. Everyone's got heavy loads. And secondly, it costs a lot. When you're bringing all those people together, it's an expensive exercise. And I think that's why it falls down, because the multidisciplinary or the multi-contextual approach, while it is the optimal, it's just hard to coordinate it and pull it together. Does it happen? Yes. When it happens, it's beautiful. And you see the children thrive. Why? Because those basic psychological needs are supported. When it doesn't work, which is unfortunately, I would say the majority of the time, it's because it's too expensive. It's too consuming. It's just so much to do. That doesn't mean we give up the goal. It just means that we do the best we can with what we've got and continue to move in that direction if we can.
Thank you, Justin. What are some of the emerging research findings or trends in the field of ADHD treatment that mental health professionals should be aware of, and how might these impact clinical practice?
Okay, I can only answer this by saying that my head is firmly and deeply in self-determination theory, because I just think that it's the best thing that's out there. And Rebecca Champ's work is at the very forefront of that. Most of the other stuff that I see around ADHD and autism delves pretty deeply into behaviorist approaches. And I find that behaviorist approaches are generally unhelpful. Why? Because they're typically extrinsically built. It's all about providing external regulators and contingencies to force some level of compliance, to coerce an outcome, or to manipulate children into doing things that do not work for them. So I tend to stay away from most of the research. For example, Russell Barkley, the guy who wrote Taking Charge of ADHD, the guy knows so much about ADHD. He's a compelling speaker. He's a wise man. I love so much of what he does, but I hate his solutions. Why? Because they fundamentally rely on behaviorist approaches and they're dehumanizing to the child. They don't support basic psychological needs. And while they might provide some... let me say one thing in favor of behaviorism, just so that you know that from a scientific point of view, I don't have my blinkers on and I'm open to whatever the science shows. Some behavioral approaches can work in that if children are struggling and there's a behavioral intervention and the child then figures out how to do something, so therefore they develop competence. So long as the behavioral approach does not rupture the relationship, builds competence, and the kid has some sense of a voice in it at some point in the process, I don't have a problem with that. When you look through Barclay's 8-step process, though, kids' voices are not there, and it's all about control and coercion and manipulation, and it just feels awful. It feels really gross. So that's why I'm not a fan of it. But I want to emphasize, for those of you who are taking a behavioral approach, if you can incorporate needs support into behavioral methods, you're moving away from strict behaviorism and you're moving into something that is far more likely to have a long-term benefit. All that to say, if you can build competence, even if it's behaviorally, sometimes you will get a boost. Why? Because the kid feels like they're progressing. As they feel like they're progressing and becoming more capable, then we can suddenly sit and go, oh, okay, I can do this. I don't have to live into the label.
It's Justin. Colby's asking if you have any recommendations for children living with comorbidities of ADHD and mobility challenges. You come across a case like that, or anything you can do to support the child and parents?
I don't have a specific response here other than one of empathy. I mean, it's just so hard. And when these parents are coming to you and they need an answer, there just aren't. I don't know. I feel bad saying it. I don't know that there are no answers, but I feel like whatever answers we have require time and patience and effort and gentleness and empathy and huge amounts of compassion. And the understanding that over time, children will develop and learn. And if they have those basic psychological needs supported, they're fundamentally going to develop in a resilient pathway. That's all I've got. I wish I had something more concrete. I wish I could point to something to this and say, you know what, if you're a single mom and you've got a child with these disabilities and they're also struggling with ADHD and you've got anxiety yourself, the thing to do is take this pill and do 3 push-ups and spin around 4 times and magically everything will be okay. But it just doesn't work like that. Life is complicated and hard. And this is one of those circumstances where you just kind of look at this person and say, I'm so sorry. This is so hard. Let's work on what we can control. Like, let's control the controllables, and we'll worry about the stuff that we can't do anything about later once we've expanded our ability to control this stuff. The great thing that I will say here is when you control the controllables, you discover that you can control more than you thought you could control because you develop your competence and capacity. And as you do that, you become more capable of controlling more in your life.
Thank you so much, Justin. One final question before we wrap it up. And we talked about non-pharmaceutical or non-pharmacological approaches and strategies. What about when do you think that it is relevant or it should be advised perhaps to use medication with kids with ADHD? What are your thoughts around that, or how early to try that, or when to try that? What does your research show?
Okay, so I'm a big believer in skills rather than pills. However, if a parent does not have the skills, or if a child simply does not have the skills, or if circumstances in life do not allow for the effective practice of skills, pills they work, they're helpful. I'm not anti-medication at all. And often, as most people will know, a pharmacological approach will provide a tamping down, a time to breathe and practice the skills. And then we can look at the pharmacological approach over time and whether that needs to be enhanced or reduced based on whether the skill development is happening and the regulation is improving. I don't have a problem with giving kids pills. The medication is there, use it. But I would always emphasize skills first, or a combined approach with a hope that eventually medication can be reduced. Look, I mean, there's a stigma around medication. whether we try to destigmatize it or not, in the general population, people feel like medication is cheating. I've had so many conversations with parents who say that. Do I believe that? No, not at all. Do you believe that? Probably not. The general population, people think that 100%. Not all of them, obviously, but many of them do. And most people who are on medication don't like it because there are side effects. They want to get off it and they want to be in control of their own lives. So use it where you need to. Encourage skill development more than anything. And hopefully a combination of the two will lead to a time where somebody can reduce or eliminate their pill usage.
Fantastic stuff, Justin. Thank you so much. For those of you that are out there and want to learn more about Justin, check out his podcast. Go to happyfamilies.com.au.
Episode number 1000 today. Awesome.
There you go, today. That's fantastic. And there is also books, resources, tips, everything you can imagine there is in that website. Have a look. We're going to share links via the handouts and also a link to Justin's credential course on MHA, evidence-based parenting, raising children to thrive. Check out your email in approximately an hour. All the information is going to be coming through, maybe a little bit over. Justin, once again, we really appreciate your time. It's always very nice chatting to you. And I guess we'll talk next time soon enough.
Yeah, love talking to you. And just a quick plug for that accredited course, the 27 hours. I know it's a lot to listen to me, but the feedback we've had on that has been just phenomenal in terms of upskilling people who are working with parents. It's really valuable, and it goes into depth on all the stuff that we've talked about today around the self-determination theory stuff and so on. So thanks for mentioning that, and it really does help.
Wonderful. Thank you very much for attending and watching this on demand now, and we'll see you next time.